Hello, I'm Karen from the needlefelter.com. Today I'm going to dye some carded wool. Then I'll use the wool to make a Panther Chameleon. I want to learn to dye small batches of wool. I want to start with some sort of food coloring because it's inexpensive and non-toxic. Rebecca from the Chem Knits channel has several YouTube videos on dyeing wool with Kool-Aid, candy, food coloring, and Easter egg dye kits. And since it's almost Easter, I decided to try the Easter egg dye tablets. I picked up a Paws Deluxe kit at my local Walmart for $1.98, and I got a Paws Neon kit for $2.76. And if you're going to purchase one, look for the kits that have the dye tablets, not the liquid or the powder. The best time to pick up these kits is when they go on clearance, which is typically the day after Easter. The kits come with a lot of stuff, but I'm only going to use the dye tablets. The Neon kit has 6 dye tablets and the Deluxe kit has 9. First, we need to pre-soak the wool by placing it in roughly room temperature tap water. I decided to use the Neon kit with 6 tablets. So I have 6 containers with lids, one for each color. I have a few ounces of Seraphina white, that's a carded wool. I measured out about 1/3 of an ounce of wool for each container. That means I'm using a total of about 2 ounces of wool. I added the wool to the water and I gently pressed it down to help saturate it. Once the wool is in the water, I loosely cover the containers and let them sit for about 3 hours. The kit instructions said to dissolve a tablet in a tablespoon of white vinegar. I was worried this concentrated dye in a tablespoon of vinegar might stain the plastic containers, so I'm going to put the vinegar and tablet in a glass first, and then we'll add a little water before we put it in the plastic container. I use 2 glasses at a time to make the process go faster. The tablets fizz when you put them in vinegar. They take about 5 minutes to dissolve completely. I added about 1 1/3 cups of water to each of the vinegar and dye tablet mixes. I carefully poured half the water into the glass so I didn't splash the dye. And then I poured that into a container and added the rest of the water. I added the wool roving and let it soak for a minute or so. And then I flipped it over to make sure the top was saturated with color. I covered the containers as I went, and when they all had dye and wool, I set the containers aside for 24 hours. The next day, they still seem to have a lot of dye in the water. You want to see the water look clear or nearly clear. That tells you that all the dye was absorbed into the wool. If it's not clear, you can wait, you can add vinegar, or you can add heat to see if that helps the dye bind to the wool. I decided to do a little bit of each. I added half a tablespoon of white vinegar to each container. Then I put 2 containers at a time in the microwave and heated them for 2 minutes on high. They weren't steaming hot, so I did another 2 minutes. I let them cool a little, covered them, and set them aside. Later that evening, the water looked better. It was getting clearer, but there was still some dye. So I repeated that heating process again and let them sit overnight. I checked them in the morning, and the water was clear in all the colors except for the blue and the purple. They still had just a hint of blue in the water. The wool looked good though, so I decided to move forward. Now we need to steam set the color. I gently squeezed the water out, and then I put the wool back in the containers with the top vented and microwaved each color 2 minutes on high. I let them sit for a minute or 2 just to sort of settle, and then I microwaved them for another minute on high. I set them aside with the top vented to cool for a few hours. After they were cool, I put half a tablespoon of Unicorn Power Scour in a gallon of room temperature water. So I soaked the light colors in this solution for 15 minutes, I rinsed them, and then did the same with the dark colors. I gently squeezed out any remaining water from the wool, and I spread the sections of wool out to dry on a sweater drying rack. Let's take a look at the wool. The yellow, green, and blue dyed perfectly. The color is even and consistent throughout. The orange wool had a few darker spots, which I suspect might be due to some pieces of dye tablet, maybe that didn't completely dissolve. The pink wool had some darker sections. They appeared to be where the wool was sitting in the bottom of the bowl. I don't remember seeing those until I did those final rounds of heating the wool to steam set the color. Maybe it got too hot in those areas, I'm not sure. And it seems to only be on the surface. I could easily pull those darker sections off if they bother me. The purple, though, had pinker sections and bluer sections. This is because the color broke, which means the pink and blue dye separated. But that said, the broken purple color doesn't bother me for this project. It'll be fine for what we're making. So let's get started on that. I wanted to make a creature that would allow me to use all 6 neon colors. I chose a Panther Chameleon because they're interesting, they have such gorgeous coloring, and their color varies. Panther Chameleons also have very interesting feet. They have 5 sort of fingers or toes on each limb, but the toes are fused into 2 groups. The front feet have a group of 3 fingers facing toward the body and a group of 2 facing away from the body, and the back feet are the opposite. To get started, as usual, I made a pattern. The link to download this pattern is in the video description and pinned comment below. You can also find any of my free patterns on my website, needlefelter.com. Just search for the animal you're looking for. I decided not to do a full armature this time. I wanted to be able to roll the tail and the legs between my palms, and to do this I needed to make the chameleon in pieces and then put them together near the end. So for the feet, I cut 4 6-inch pieces of 32 gauge cloth wrapped wire. I found the center and bent the wires in half. So about 5/8 of an inch down, I'd bend the wire up at a 90-degree angle. I separate the 2 bent ends. I bent one side up at approximately 1/8 of an inch for the 2 fingers and the other side up at about 3/16 of an inch for the 3 fingers. And that gave me 2 loops, one for each set of fingers on either side of the foot. I cut 4 3.5-inch pieces of 22 gauge cloth wrapped wire for the legs. And then I attached each foot to a leg by wrapping the 2 ends of the foot wire up the leg. And for the body, I cut an 11-inch piece of 22 gauge wire, fold the body wire in half, and loosely twist it to give it some extra strength. Before I started making the chameleon, I needed to figure out where I would place the 6 neon colors. I printed my pattern and filled it in with colored pencils. It was kind of like doing a coloring page. The only problem was I ended up doing this literally 8 times before I came up with a version I loved, and that was this one. For the tail, I cut one 9-inch piece of 22 gauge cloth wrapped wire. I added a little glue to the wire and wrapped about 6 3/4 inches of the tail in this light green. I built up layers, felting them in place until they matched the pattern. And I felted the layers on by holding the needle at an angle. I was trying to keep the needle from going all the way through the tail, or at least not go through deliberately. And then I rolled the tail between my hands. This is the main reason I made the tail a separate piece from the body. Being able to roll it helps you really get it nice and round and smooth out the surface. I also misted the tail with water and rolled it some more to help it felt. The tail surface needs to be somewhat firm to be ready to receive the stripes, otherwise they will just sink in instead of staying on top. I worried that I didn't have enough yellow to make all 4 legs and the head. Luckily, I had some yellow merino comb top in my stash. I built the legs with that instead of core wool, mainly because I didn't want white core wool poking through the legs or the feet when I added yellow on top. Yellow poking through yellow wouldn't be a problem. To secure the foot to the ankle, I wrapped a thin strip of wool around the ankle and then crisscrossed it over that loose foot wire to lock it in place. Then I built the feet up with small pieces of wool. I tried to keep the wool flat like a ribbon and wrap each side of the foot, felting the wool as I went. The feet need to be kept thin because we'll be adding that neon yellow color on top of this sort of yellow merino base. After I built up the feet and the legs, I made the bends for the knees. I looked at reference photos for the body and the head. The core wool body has narrow hips, kind of a wider belly and rib section, and then narrows again at the shoulder. The head is kind of wedge-shaped. It's narrower at the nose and widest just behind the eyes. My head still needs a lot of work, but this gives it a good core foundation. And most of that work will be done later with the neon colors. I began adding the orange stripes to the tail. I decided to wait to add the last blue stripe, that would be the one closest to the body, just in case I needed to adjust the width of it or the position of it once the tail and the legs are attached to the body. I added neon yellow wool over the yellow merino on the legs and the feet. I did my best to mirror the stripes from the opposite leg. The body will be between them, so they don't have to be perfect, but you want them to at least look related. I attached each stripe with just the tip of a 40 gauge needle. As I felt it, I again tried not to let the needle go all the way through. I smoothed the legs by misting them with water and rolling them also between my fingers or my palms. You want to apply some pressure as you do this, but you also want to check that the wool isn't moving around or getting fuzzy. That can happen if the surface wasn't felted down enough before you rolled it. And then again, as with the tail, I decided to wait to add the final pink stripe closest to the body until I could see how the legs would look when they were attached. The bottom of a real chameleon's feet should be more of an off-white, and I debated about whether or not to do that, but I think the toes would end up being too thick, so I'm just leaving them yellow. I covered the body in neon green wool. I had to trim back the core wool on the front of the head because I realized it was a little too long. And then I rolled and felted 2 small spheres of core wool, one for each eyeball. I felted a thin sheet of blue in sort of a shovel shape to start making the crest on the top of the head. I needed to do that early so I could test the fit of it over the nose and the eyes. After looking at reference photos of chameleon's eyes, I decided to try using some 4mm glass eyes on top of those spheres. I painted the back of a set of clear glass eyes with a metallic pinkish lavender nail polish. I added a tiny rope of purple to the edge and center of the blue crest piece. Then I attached it to the top of the nose. I tried a piece of green wool under the back end of the crest. I had it that way in my coloring page, but it didn't look good. I just decided to build that area up in yellow instead of green. I created that sort of flap of skin underneath the head and down the neck with neon yellow wool. I attached the tail by poking a hole in the body and then adding E6000 glue to the wire. There was a little section of the top edge of the spine that was missing, so I felted a filler piece for this area. I wanted to share this just to show you that when you need to make a filler piece, make it larger than the missing section, as it will condense as you felt it in place. I tested the position of the back legs by poking a hole for their wire just to check their position. Then I added pins as placeholders while I felted that pink stripe closest to the body. I glued the back legs in place with E6000 glue. I was so happy that I waited to add that last blue stripe on the tail until it was attached to the body. It turned out I needed to add more neon green wool to create a believable transition from the tail to the body. I glued the front legs in place without adding the final stripe. And then I added the final blue stripe, some yellow wool to the shoulders, and those final pink stripes. I also noticed that one of the back legs' thigh was a little wider than the other, so I added some yellow wool to even them out. To finish up, I just needed to add the purple stripes and the white stripe along either side of the chameleon's body. Let's take a look at the result. Here's where we started, and here's what we ended up with. My neon Easter egg die, Panther Chameleon, is done. This project was so much fun, and I learned how to dye small batches of wool. I'm so excited about that. This was all good stuff that added much needed fuel to my needle felting fire. And as usual, if you have questions or comments, leave them below. And thanks for watching.